believer in man-made climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, you live in these big houses and you fly around in a private jet. And Bill Gates' answer was, I think, very telling. Mm-hmm. He said, well, that's absolutely true. But I purchase carbon offsets.
Right.
So in other words, you're rich. Now, again, the carbon market and all that is it's exceptionally complicated. And I consider myself to be an intelligent, smart person, but even I can't make heads or tails out of it entirely, okay? But the underlying message of Bill Gates in that interview was, I'm rich, I can afford to purchase offsets, therefore I can live the lifestyle of a rich and famous person, irrespective of what I'm doing to the environment, because I purchased these offsets,
right?
Because I can afford to. Mm-hmm. Well, what about mom and dad out there that can't afford? They don't even know where do I purchase? Okay, can I purchase some of those offsets so that I can drive to and from the office every day? It's a nonsensical position to take, and it allows people to basically wiggle out of, forget the Chinese and India, even the biggest producers of so-called greenhouse gases in our society, who are making the loudest claims about it. They themselves aren't adjusting their own practices, but they can get away with it because they're rich and famous.
Right. So and
they have no shame. Here he is. It never occurred to him in this interview how that could be construed. And unfortunately, it appears not to have occurred to Chris Wallace either, because he didn't challenge him on it.
Yeah. So what it amounts to is, if you're rich enough, you don't have to reduce emissions. You can do whatever you want.
Exactly.
Yeah, which of course sounds very much opposed to the left-wing, what do you call it, social justice. I mean, that's totally opposite to what they're saying they support. So going back to the ideal platform then, for ideal policy for the Canadian Conservative Party of Canada, it makes sense then for them to have a Made in Canada climate change plan that benefits Canadians instead of virtue signaling. So it strikes me that if they were to get up in the House of Commons and say what we've been saying, namely that, yes, climate change is a real problem, so we have to do something about it, since Canada cannot stop it, no matter whether we think we're causing it or not, the only sensible approach to benefit Canadians who elect us is to have adaptation policies and to stop with our emissions control. I mean, that to me sounds like a sensible plan, and also one in which they can say, furthermore, this will give us the wealth that we need to protect the environment in other areas. Because if you bankrupt your country, you end up like Somalia, where they don't care about the environment. So, I mean, obviously, you want to do something that's going to give you the strength to actually be able to afford environmental policies.
Right.
And you do that not by crippling your biggest breadwinner, which is our fossil fuel industry. You do that by having proper pollution control, of course.
Of course.
But you have a policy that focuses on adaptation. And to me, that the contrast then between a sensible conservative climate platform and the Liberals' sort of Peter Pan type approach, surely don't you think that would appeal to Canadians once they understand it?
Well, Tom, we conducted a couple of focus groups last fall, and we found that there was considerable support for the idea of policy, not that entirely ignored the area of emissions, but that focused principally on adaptation. Mm-hmm. That people really understood that, actually that makes sense. And one of the things that came out of those focus groups, I thought that was the most telling, was that they hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. Mm-hmm. And when it was framed, when the whole climate change debate was framed that way, that people were prepared to look at it and go, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And
one of the problems that we have, when we talk about the squeaky wheel, is that the only noise out there is the wheel being squeaky. Mm-hmm. And that's because that the Conservatives, who, as evidenced by the vote at this convention, don't buy into the whole, the earth is, the sky's falling and the earth is going to end in 11 years or whatever, okay? So they're receptive to this. Mm-hmm. And, if the Conservatives are receptive to this, then there's going to be a lot of people out there who maybe wouldn't call themselves conservative who are going to be receptive as well. But the problem is nobody's saying it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's the old story of the leader, the French radicals yelling, where are my people? I'm their leader. I have to follow them, right? At some point in time, you have to, as a political leader, you have to stand for something, and you have to say, this is what I believe. This is the direction we're going to go, and damn the polls. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the funny thing about this, and now I'm taking off my, I'm not speaking as a scientist, but I am putting on my communications expert hat, okay? The funny thing is that when a politician actually starts talking this way about any issue, mm-hmm. funny thing happens, people start following.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you keep silent because the polls tell you if you talk about this, they're not going to vote for you, mm-hmm. the right response is, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, the right response is to start talking about it. Mm-hmm. Because if you start talking about it, you will change minds. Right. What makes an idea mainstream is that you treat it as mainstream. Mm-hmm. There's no scientific measurement as to what is or isn't a mainstream idea. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of things that the Conservatives, lots of policy areas that the Conservatives become the authors of their own destiny or authors of their own demise, mm-hmm. because they don't want to go out and make the argument. And as Margaret Thatcher used to say, and I was a big fan of Margaret Thatcher, I wasn't so much a Reaganite as I was a Thatcherite. Yeah. She had a few very interesting sayings. And one of the sayings was, you can't win the argument if you never make it.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's just the reality. And that's...
Yeah. And that's supported by the research because, about 8 or 9 years ago, there was a study that came out from McGill University, from professors at McGill University, Ohio State University, and Drexel University in the United States. And they showed that when politicians all said the same thing on the side of climate alarmism, the public support for it was high. But when the Republicans actually split and started to doubt the climate scare, public support went way down for the climate scare. And so they showed that, in fact, it's the opinion of elites, and in particular political leaders, that drives public opinion. So if you wait for public opinion to change before the politicians start saying it, it may never happen. Whereas, in fact, it's the politician's job to influence public opinion by making sensible arguments.
Partly.
Yeah,
partly, for sure.
Partly, and not just to stay in power, but to actually lead the country in a sensible direction, which will eventually make people vote for them.
Right. Well, and this, of course, is the whole argument that some of us are making within conservative circles, is we're saying, look, we don't deny climate change. Of course, climate changes. Climate has always been changing.
Yeah, or we'd be stuck in the last ice age.
Or we'd be stuck in the last ice age. But we're Canadian. Okay. And by the way, dare I even remind people that this whole idea about net zero emissions by 2050 or whatever it is now, and I keep hearing people talking now about 2030. The Paris Agreement, as you well know, Tom, actually doesn't set out what those targets are for individual countries. It's the Canadian government itself that adopted those. It wasn't, nobody said to Canada, you have to meet these and that's part of your obligation pursuant to the treaty. Mm-hmm. The treaty actually allows the individual governments to set their own targets.
Right. And then they make it legislated that they have to do it. It's not actually the Paris Accord that's forcing them at all.
So there's all of this talk about net zero, whatever that means. Yeah. Bill Gates' definition of net zero. Yeah. It's all stuff that we are inflicting on ourselves without even pressure from the international community pursuant to any kind of an agreement. Mm-hmm. But let's circle back, okay? Climate change is real, irrespective of what's causing it. Mm-hmm. There's very little that we could do in Canada to affect the world, okay? It's not going to happen. What we do in Canada is not going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. So whether it's man-made or it's totally natural, it's going to happen. And so our responsibility as leaders in Canada ought to be to ensure that Canadians are prepared And that means focusing principally on adaptation, strengthening our infrastructure. And by the way, if you want a made in Canada environmental policy, let's stop talking exclusively about climate change, and let's talk about tens of thousands of Canadians from coast to coast who are living in rundown poor communities who don't have access to clean drinking water.
Right.
As though we're in a third world country.
Yeah, especially on native reserves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, adaptation when it comes to climate change, and clean air, clean land, clean water for every Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a sensible, sellable, made in Canada climate change, made in Canada environmental policy that is not ignoring climate change.
Yeah. And you know, Mary Jean Harris, my researcher with ICSC Canada, she did a nice little 1-minute video on how across the world only 5% of the money is going to adaptation, and the fact in Canada it's only 13%. And, you know, even the UN, Joseph, wanted it to be a 50-50 split. So, in fact, a good argument that Conservatives could make is that it's not moral to let people suffer today due to natural climate change and other environmental problems because you're spending your money on what might happen to somebody generations in the future. And you know, that argument, I think, is one that Conservatives can make as well, that the Liberal approach currently is only 13% on adaptation. So you're letting people suffer today because you're focused on this impossible goal of Canada affecting the climate in, 50 years or something.
Right. And while you are ignoring the standard that was set by the very international community that you claim to be following, the United Nations.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a moral argument internationally and nationally that they could make, which would show that their plan is more moral than the Liberals.
Can I also say, Tom, just on a related topic that nobody's talking about yet, but I think it's time for us to start this conversation on the environment as well, and that is the looming catastrophe that is out there when all of these solar panels reach their life expectancy.
Yeah.
And we start having to talk about recycling and disposal, etc. That is an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. And it's not happening today, and it's not happening tomorrow. But all of the people who are putting in these solar panels, despite the fact, set aside for a second, the fact that there's more greenhouse gas emissions generated by the manufacturer of these solar panels.
Make them with coal, yeah.
Okay, but here people are using them, and God bless them. They want to reduce their electrical costs, okay, or they want to do what's good for the environment, and nobody's telling them. Nobody's out there is raising any kind of an alarm over the question of what are we going to do with all of these in 5, 10, 15 years when we actually have to start disposing of them.
Yeah.
I think that's, if you want to start talking also about a potential environmental problem early enough that we can actually come up with a way of dealing with it before it becomes a crisis. Okay. I mean, this is real. Whatever happens with climate change, Tom, okay, I don't believe what, Prince Charles talks about, in 12 years, we've reached a tipping point and we're going to be around in 12 years. The climate's going to, nobody should be afraid that way.
Yeah.
But you should be afraid about the toxic impact of those solar panels in another 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. And also the impact of all the used turbine blades, these massive big blades that they can't really do anything with them. And this goes back actually to Michael Moore's film, a left-winger who was chastising the environmental movement for promoting wind and solar power, ignoring the environmental cost of wind and solar power, which can be huge because they use so many, rare earths coming from China to make the magnets for the generators and the turbines, and of course they're produced under terrible conditions. Yet the whole field is ready for the Conservatives to say things that actually make sense instead of just following this politically correct mantra.
And then to add insult to injury, the companies that are manufacturing these panels in China don't even have to worry about purchasing carbon offsets.
No, exactly.
They get away scot-free.
Yeah.
It's, if I was sitting down and writing a script for some sort of a comedy, I might come up with these things, okay? Because